I'm really honored to be the speaker in this marvelous series that you instituted. I mean, Bruce, as you said, was a friend, although we didn't see each other all that much, certainly not much after his retirement, although in Bodrum a couple of times we met. And he was, I think as Murat said, he was always warm, and you knew that he was there, and he was all there. So I'm really honored. So the title of my talk is an allusion to one of the articles that Murat had in mind, I think. There's an article that he wrote, which was published in New Perspectives on Turkey in 2011. And it was on the impact of the 2001 crisis on vulnerable social groups at the household level in urban areas, Istanbul really, and other urban areas. The article is titled Economic Crises and the Social Structuring of Economic Hardship, the Impact of the 2001 Turkish Crisis. As you can see, my title today is an allusion to his title because it's all about social structuring of economic hardship. And the question is how this structuring happens. So he, of course, is a veritable sociologist, and I think I am much more of a political economist. But he states in the beginning that the inquiry that he embarks on, quote, relates to a central theme of classical sociology. How does economic change affect social structure and systems of stratification? Indeed, this is probably the major theme of sociology, dynamic sociology, sociology that looks at transformations. And he concludes, and this is again a quote from the article, says the role of factors typically studied in stratification analysis, such as class, gender, and ethnicity, seem to be especially relevant to the social structuring of economic hardship, which is a conclusion which, of course, most of the classics in sociology come to. But of course, the idea is that you should be able to illustrate it properly and validate the contention. He also says that after looking at all the facts on the ground, he's using a 2009 survey of households. And he also says that what is needed is social policy reform. In fact, at the time, in the first decade of this century, social policy was a very popular topic because the government then, as it's the same government as now, of course, I mean the same party certainly, was very much involved in social policy reform, with especially the health transformation reform and other new items such as I will be talking about cash transfers to the poor in mostly, in fact, in the southeast of Turkey. Now, as it happens, at the time of 2001 crisis, this was for people who have forgotten about it or people who were not there to register it. In fact, this was a huge crisis it was a purely economic crisis, of course, due to various crises that we are used to, such as the currency crisis and just plain mishandling of the economy, which of course we are very much familiar with. Now, as it happens, this the severity of the crisis meant that a lot of people, a lot of sociologists, economists were interested in what was going on, and they sort of started doing surveys, interviewing people, looking at the figures as much as they existed, and trying to come up with ways of understanding what was going on and ways of proposing remedies. Now, at the time, I was at Boğaziçi, and we had started the Social Policy Forum, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And with my colleague Ayşe Bura, we also conducted a survey in poor neighborhoods of Istanbul. We talked to people in households, and we talked to especially the muhtars. And since then, I always tell my students that if you want to do anything, first go and talk to the muhtars. And then, of course, with the proviso that you know what the slant of the muhtar is, then you go on to talk to other people on the street or in the households. But anyway, what we concluded then was things had really changed, and there was a new kind of poverty that we should really be aware of. And that the nature of work, nature of employment, which was very unstable employment, the sort of formal idea of employment was really quite alien to the poor people, in the sense that they didn't really know what their employment would be next month or where their money would be coming from. And there were various different kinds of sources of their incomes. So given the nature of work and the nature of income at the time, as well as the constitution of communities. So it wasn't the case any longer that people could count on extended family, or they could count on some in-kind help from the mosque or from the political party or whatever. These things were not really working, were not really functioning properly either. So both in terms of sort of the economic revenues, economic incomes, and in terms of the in-kind social assistance from the community, things were not working as one might think. So in that sense, poverty was quite entrenched. And this situation of precarity, although this term was not used at the time, I think, or not as much certainly, the situation of precarity could not really be repaired by sort of ordinary remedies of economic growth, because the kind of employment that people thought might happen was not going to happen. Or traditional social policy measures, which were mostly related to formal employment. So this was really the basis of the discussion on social programs, the basis of the discussion on the welfare regime, because as in many other countries as well, social welfare was designed initially, starting with Bismarck, of course, everybody starts with Bismarck, as something that provided security to workers. And then continuing with both the Scandinavian experience and what was happening after the Second World War in England, the so-called beverage plan or the beverage type of welfare, most welfare regimes in the world had to do with the assumption that people would be at risk only when they either lost their work, lost their employment, so that they were temporarily unemployed, or after they retired, or after they, when they became sick so that they couldn't work. So welfare was designed to address those situations of risk during the life experience. So the idea here was in the results of our research that this cannot really be the case any longer, in the sense that people were at risk at all times. It wasn't just because they were sick or they were on pension, and they were poor. So what do you do with poverty such as that? So the solution we proposed was increasing the incomes of the poor through social assistance. In other words, you cannot rely on employment, you cannot rely on increasing their wages, you cannot rely on making sure that they will have secure and stable employment, because they won't. And that's not their fault, because in fact, that's what the world has come to. So the idea was there would be no stable employment anymore. And this wasn't, of course, only in Turkey. Everywhere people were saying this, because the so-called neoliberal world, together with globalization, was generating insecurities because the economy was too dynamic. It was changing all the time. There was a lot of competition with new coming countries with very low wage rates. And there was, of course, also the ordinary economic crises that we knew that capitalism was always saddled with. But they had just now accelerated, in the sense that the rhythm now was much faster. So the thing is that social policy, having evolved like that, excluded any notion of, any understanding of cash payments. So in other words, to say, for instance, that, social policy should be something like universal subsidies, monthly subsidies to people with so many children, or subsidies to people with this kind of work, etc., was not something that was within the purview of classical welfare regimes. So straight cash payments to the poor were some small part of the regime, not in Turkey, but elsewhere. And such grants were often means tested, in the sense that they required a lot of sort of bureaucratic involvement of the people who wanted the cash grants, and they were quite grudgingly disposed. In other words, they were not considered to be a right. So in a period that was defined by neoliberal globalization, the relations, the economic relations are dynamic, and employment is not stable. And there are frequent downturns, training and skills become obsolete. So formal employment is scarce. Even people who have formal employment can lose it after a few years, and they have to spend a whole long period before they can retrain themselves, or they can find another stable employment. So unemployment benefits are not of much use. So one of the achievements of neoliberalism is transforming communities even further, such that the kind of thing that we were referring to, social networks that might help people to survive these kinds of risks, those have also suffered. So, I mean, the whole idea of the neoliberal individual, the neoliberal self, is that all the notions of sort of individuals sort of being their own owners and individuals having to sort of scramble for livelihood is something that is unfortunately that has been internalized. So it's even in Turkey, even in a place like Turkey, where some of the old social networks and social sort of structures are still surviving, it looked like from that point of view then that this kind of expectation was no longer forthcoming. So during this period, this neoliberal period that of course was when we were doing this kind of survey and when Bruce was writing about it, so roughly 40 years between 1980 and 2020, let's say, social policy reforms were quite conflicted. On the one hand, the World Bank, of course, had a lot to do with these reforms. And the World Bank was partly acting as the left hand of the imperial order. In other words, sort of the institution which proposed reforms that might aid the most downtrodden, the most poor, the most unprivileged people in society. It was instrumental, for instance, in instituting the true reforms which are closer to the kind of sort of cash assistant and universal type reforms that in mind. Those important reforms were first the health reform, which some of you may not be aware of it, but it was part of a sort of a blueprint that was proposed to all kinds of countries in Latin America and also in Asia, and also to Turkey. So it's a reform. It has been much criticized for being neoliberal because it served to bring the market in. So in comparison to a purely state, a purely sort of a public and a state run health reform, which of course is possible, and it's certainly the case still in the world in many places, including England, including Britain. But it was neoliberal in the sense that it was sort of bringing the market in. But at the same time, it was universalizing health access and sort of separating it from any kind of employment concerns. So everybody could become a member in the universalized health reform, and poor people didn't have to worry about it as long as it was still means tested, but as long as they proved to be poor, and the government would be paying their premiums. So regardless of employment situation and regardless of income levels, you could be part of this new universalized health system. So from that point of view, it was this universal aspect of it that made it different than what had been the case before. The second such reform was even closer to what I talked about before, because it was a pure cash transfer. And that's once again, it's called the conditional cash transfer in other words, payment to poor families on the condition that they send their kids to school, or with preschool kids on the condition that they make sure that they are seen by doctors once in a while. And now, this wasn't a large sum that was promised to poor families, but it was still something, and it was something that they could count on, that they would be able to get it every month. It didn't look like a big sum from, I guess, the point of view of the western part of the country, but obviously in the very poor places, especially in the east and southeast, it was something that was cherished. So it did alleviate poverty to some extent with minimum means testing, but certainly insufficient. However, I mean, these are the kinds of reforms that the World Bank was pushing at the time. So in that sense, this is why I called it sort of the left hand of the imperial order. But as I said, this is a conflicted situation because there were other things that were going on, which were much closer to the neoliberal blueprint. And one I will mention is the one in the US that Bill Clinton, the president at the time in 1996, he gave into the worst neoliberal instincts of his party. And he declared that he was ending welfare as we know it in favor of a payment to single mothers conditional on their looking for work and finding it within 2 years. In other words, there used to be a welfare, it was called welfare, although it was part of the welfare regime, but it was a cash transfer to single mothers. And the idea was, if they were poor, they would be getting this. Now, Bill Clinton's reform, which was a purely neoliberal reform, said that no, we have to ask people to prove to us, to demonstrate to us that they are actually looking for work. So it's not enough to be poor and to have to take care of kids. You have to be showing us that you are looking for work, even if it's not going to pay you anything, even if your transportation costs are going to be higher than the wages that you get. And also, if within 2 years you don't find employment, then we'll cut it off. So this was really ending a program that had been quite successful since the 60s, and starting this sort of idea that everybody should be scrambling all the time to find work, even if they're going to be ending up worse off than they were. Now, so this is just to show how conflicting the situation was over the world in the neoliberal period. Also, at the same time, and you are all aware of this, I'm sure, there was a succession of tax cuts for the rich. And this, of course, came together with the idea that we should make the government as small as possible, because if it is not small and if it is successful, then people will want more. So the idea was that you should, in fact, discourage the citizens from wanting more from the state. And this was sort of the basis of the neoliberal idea. So the struggle against what was considered a big state was really quite universal. And it strikes me as something that's very difficult to explain, that even in Turkey, this idea of the state having to be small is quite prevalent, certainly by the governments, because, I mean, as we know, the sort of the idolatry of the state is unchallenged, and people sort of sing the praises of the state all the time. But then, even here, there has been a reticence to institute a proper income tax to make the revenues of the state substantial and less temperamental in terms of the levels than now. So state revenues now derive mostly from the very unwieldy indirect taxes. And there's no attempt, despite all the other things that this government, which has been here almost 20 years, has done and probably could easily do, they are opposed to this idea of trying to do something about income tax. And by the way, this idea of the income tax, even in the 1950s, foreign economists who were invited to help with economic reform to Ankara would always say, look, you have to institute some kind of an income tax because otherwise, you won't be able to do anything. And so, it's been so many years and we're still there. Now, we owe it to the current conjuncture of the pandemic. So we're talking about today now, that there has occurred a radical shift in this conversation about the welfare regimes, about social welfare. Some commentators have welcomed the transformation as the end of 40 years of neoliberalism. This may well be premature, yet it is true that states over the entire spectrum have embraced with varying degrees of success the role of guardian of the society. Now, this idea, guardian of the society, is an important one. So, obviously we know this from the patrimonial heritage of the Ottoman Empire, where the state did in fact take on that role, very unsuccessfully mostly, but this notion that the state was responsible for provisioning the society, in other words, for making sure that society gets what it needs in terms of consumption or in terms of other things, was very important and was part of the patrimonial ideal. But look at what's happening now. The states, all states, have been active, very active from the very beginning in trying to get masks, ventilators, protective clothes for hospital personnel, ICU beds, and now, of course, we are witnessing all the struggles going on and all the vaccine nationalism that we are aware of. And, pretty soon we might see people, countries going to war against each other because of vaccines. And there's a huge focus on how countries will be getting vaccines, and states say, well, we're responsible. We'll get it for you. So as far as I know, there hasn't been a single state where vaccines are an item that the market will distribute according to principles of the market. So when the society is in such disarray, obviously there's no social movement, such as Occupy, for instance, to force states to try to succeed in provisioning of the society. So, in other words, the states are doing it on their own, all states. So my proposal here, or my hypothesis, is that we might, in fact, think that states are responding to a perceived threat that might come from loss of legitimacy. I mean, obviously, this is a kind of situation that might lead very well to a legitimacy crisis of the state, because what is the state good for if it cannot protect its citizens against a natural disaster? I mean, this is sort of the entire sort of Hobbesian contract. The state will protect us from some things. I mean, it's always been the case that the state is supposed to protect us from outside things, from people who might attack us, but also from things like the plague and other kinds of pestilence. Well, in this particular case, the state immediately took on that role. So I think it's an instance, as in history there are several instances, of a conjuncture when the state must act autonomously in order to sustain its legitimacy. So it's a question of the state having to, states deciding this. So obviously this is a kind of theory of the state that is very different than the usual orthodox Marxist type state, because the state here is more of a state in the sense that, for instance, Machiavelli was talking about it, or all kinds of other people, certainly in England and Germany, were talking about it. So in this particular situation, commitments to neoliberal orthodoxy can be easily jettisoned, gotten rid of, and short-term interests of cronies or big capitalists may be ignored because concerns regarding legitimacy are paramount. So in other words, you don't have to have an actual social movement forcing you to do it because you're going to be doing it out of fear. So in a lot of countries, this temporary autonomy implied radical intervention in the economic environment as well. So it's not just because of the health situation, it's not only masks and vaccines, but the economic situation is something that states seem to have taken on to do something about it. So we know that it's not a situation where the old policies of creating more activity or interest rates or tax breaks, etc., will have anything successful out of it, because I mean, to say that there should be more employment is self-defeating, because what you want to do is you want to lock in people to make sure that they don't go out. And so therefore the potential demand is not going to be forthcoming, because the pandemic conditions require that you make sure that people don't go out and get sick and make other people sick. So potential consumption in a way is also physically prevented. So, I mean, look at, for instance, tourism in Turkey and also in many other countries. An entire sector has closed, and the cost of maintaining the buildings, the restaurants, shops, planes, airports has to be assumed, because no state can say, we don't care because we don't really have to worry about what's going to come out of this and whether or not the infrastructure will still be there, because tourism is a huge earner of foreign exchange. But generally, in a lot of countries, tourism is certainly more than 5-6%, or probably closer to 10% of their entire GDP. So, in other words, in a situation like that, the involvement in the economy of the state is quite understandable, because the state has to also not think only in terms of the current health of the citizens, but also what will happen to them when things become more normal. And the only way that they can deal with it is through direct infusion of cash. So this is coming back to sort of the cash, throwing cash at things. Most rich countries are engaging in direct support payments to small entrepreneurs, to payments to furloughed workers, to reduced hour workers, to the unemployed in Turkey as well. The unemployment fund is being used for this, although, of course, it's much less generous than, for instance, what's going on in England or what's going on to some extent in the US, but also in other European Union countries. So the problem is there's an assumption here that things will be coming back. And in fact, our throwing cash at the state throwing cash at these things is sort of a temporary thing because it's going to be over and then everything will be coming back. Now, that's not at all a good assumption because all kinds of surveys find that some of the people who are unemployed will not be hired back. All kinds of surveys find that shops that are closing are not going to be reopened. This has to do with the fact that lifestyles, work structures, consumption patterns are changing as we see. As we experience it, these changes have impact on whether or not some of these economic activities will be, in fact, coming back. And it's likely that they won't be coming back to the same extent. And there will be, if there are more than 20% unemployed now, it's entirely possible that half of them are not going to be re-employed when things are over. Most importantly, perhaps the smaller service industries or service providers, grocery stores and small manufacturing and small cafes and bars and restaurants. Instead of, these are now closed. A lot of them are closed because the lifestyle has changed. The way in which people consume and which people live has changed. They don't go out. They can't go out mostly, or they think they can't go out. And instead, they sit home and order. And as you know, everywhere in the neighborhoods in Istanbul, you have armies of delivery people who bring shopping and meals to homes. Elsewhere as well, the huge increase in Amazon's volume of business is well known. Or the fact that people don't go to the cinema and they don't go to the theater. Instead, they sit home and watch Netflix is also well known. So this staying at home and not going out means the closing of shops and closing and also unemployment of the people who used to be there. So how much of this is going to remain after the pandemic is over? So staying at home with an expanding spectrum of home activities, such as cooking and homeschooling, of course, has other effects. So one of the least popular side effects of the pandemic has been the fact that children are staying home and are not going to school, which means that there has to be somebody at home who takes care of children, who has to entertain them, who has to try to educate them, and who at the same time, of course, would have to feed them, make food, etc. So as we know, schools don't only educate, they socialize children and they provide intelligent surveillance over children. So this particular dimension of the lock-in also has implications for women. And this, I'm sure you have read about this as well. This implication on the women is that women families basically are imprisoned at home these days because, especially if they have children, there has to be somebody taking care of them. So this is why, or it's one reason why, women's labor force participation has been going down precipitously. It used to be, over the last 10, 15 years, labor force participation of women was going up steadily, not in agriculture, but in urban stuff. And it was climbing almost 1% a year for a while. But now it looks like it really has come down quite a lot from like 35% to 30% or something like that. So women's workload is increasing, and at the same time, of course, they are losing paying employment. This is not something that, this is something that we have seen, of course, before with women when they get married or when they have children leaving the workforce. But that was compensated with more people deciding to work. But now it looks like that's also going in the other direction. And what that means, of course, is that families are now making less money. And that might, of course, perhaps not for middle-class families, but certainly for other families that are poorer, that is going to be a problem. So once again, this is something that's more permanent, along with all the shops closing and some unemployed people not being able to come back. So this also, however, is something that one has to register, that a lot of people are talking about this, that women are sort of unfairly put in situations where they have to remain in the house and do all kinds of things with children, etc. And that leads to, of course, people saying, well, if this government is, or if the state is so much interested in provisioning and so much interested in being the guardian of families and of society as a whole, then they should spend more money on providing for child services, nurseries, and creches, and generally yuva type things that are good for primary school kids after they come from school. Why aren't there publicly funded programs to make more of these, to build more of these, and to hire more people to actually staff them? So this is something that also is fueled by the new stance of the state that says, I'm going to be your guardian. So this is one thing that I think was quite prominent in the last few months. Another thing that was quite prominent had to do with schools, again, schooling of children where there's no in-person education. So kids have to somehow find a way of hooking up with internet, and they have to have the hardware, a laptop or a tablet or whatever. And a lot of newspapers wrote about how kids were finding it very difficult to find a place, a space, if their house is not internet provided, to be able to connect. And that's a real thing. And don't forget that this government in particular has been promising a tablet to each school children for some time, maybe 10 years almost, and it hasn't been forthcoming. So once again, this might well be something that actually is a point of contention, and a point that might mobilize some kind of a movement to get the government to spend more money on these kinds of things. Once again, it would be something that is just given, regardless of employment situation, regardless of all the other more classical items that come with the welfare regime. So my point is that all countries attempted to compensate for the loss of employment incomes, and in some cases for revenue of small business. They printed money or took from unemployment funds without yet trying to increase taxes on the rich. But the new climate of provident states may well guarantee that such social assistance, if it faces no real opposition, will tend to gain permanence. In the sense that, it's an old rule that if something is done that is good and people like it, it's very difficult for a state, for a government to take it back from the people. So, in other words, these kinds of programs, once they are there, provide their own clients and will bring about a kind of resistance to taking them out of action. So the idea then is that direct cash transfers to sustain the livelihood of those whose incomes are precarious will probably be instituted in the near future, even if and when pandemic conditions end. There's an interesting anecdote, not an anecdote, even just a little thing, that Rishi Sunak, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, he's the finance minister basically, and more, he was spending some huge amount of money for these kinds of things. And they said, well, where are you going to find the money? He said, oh, we will spend now and tax later, which is, of course, from the neoliberal point of view, it's crazy because neoliberals don't even want to spend anything, because what if it means that the state will have to be permanently larger? So, there are other ways of doing it as well, not simply relying on future taxes, but also simply, if a country has its own currency, it's not a big problem to spend as much as it wants. So going a bit further, if the US is still a trendsetter in these matters, the remarkable relief package of $1.9 trillion that was legislated a few days ago contains many measures which conform to the notion of cash transfers. One measure that's novel for the US, similar programs, it's new for the US, but similar programs exist in European countries, is direct monthly payments to families with low income for each child. A family may be paid, it's now for 1 year, but probably it will become permanent. A family will be paid $300 per month for each child. So this is being interpreted in the US as a timid start for an eventual basic income program. I want to add here that the basic income program was, you might remember, in the form of a universal basic income. It was something that was advocated by one of the candidates to the Democratic nomination to presidency before Biden became the nominee. His name is Andrew Young, and Andrew Young is now the front-running person for the mayorship of New York. Now, the New York mayor is probably the second most important job in American politics because not only is he a mayor of 8 million people, but also sort of the nerve center of America that he is going to be mayor of if he wins. At the moment, he seems to be running quite a bit ahead of the others. And his biggest proposal is a basic income for New Yorkers. So the immediate future, with or without basic income, will witness a state that has to spend more on social assistance to provide the precarious population with some security and stability, and basic conditions to overcome exclusion. Now, this does not imply that income distribution problems and other inequalities will find solution. In fact, the polarizing practices of the lock-in phase have been extensively discussed. The huge increase in the wealth of some capitalists, the employment conditions of people working from home with good internet and hardware versus those who had to brave crowded transport and possibly unsafe workplaces, people who could escape to their summer home while others continue to live in cramped apartments. These inequalities are probably unchanging realities of capitalism, with the proviso that there will most likely be taxes on the rich and more public funds will be directed toward securitizing programs. So, in other words, certainly basic income or cash transfers in general are not a solution to all problems. It's just that they are good for making lives at the very bottom more secure and more stable. So with all this speculation, I want to suggest that human costs after the pandemic may be structured in a novel way, with a different conception of welfare, more adequate to the current realities of economic and social life. When Bruce wrote his paper on the 2001 crisis, there was no ground to imagine this mode of transformation and the inception of a new regulation of lives under capitalism. But I think it's now possible to have that hope, and it's probably possible to speculate on the possibilities of these new types of social assistance and new roles for states. Thank you.